Anthony Hartcher, your wealthy urge, mind coach, and lifestyle medicine specialist. The purpose of this podcast is to enhance and enlighten your well-being. And yes, I'm back on the show to do that just for you. It's on the basis of some feedback I got from the longevity podcast that I did a couple of episodes ago, probably 3 episodes ago from memory. I spoke about longevity and the anti aging industry and how the actual focus on the future was actually accelerating aging. And I discussed that in the podcast, either being attached to the past around a ageless body or a body that's not aging. So being attached to that past self or being fixated or fantasizing over a future self. And yes, it's good to have aspirations and work towards health, but just the fixation and obsession over longevity will actually invoke aging because we'll get emotional when we get cues or signs or symptoms that we're actually aging. And it's inevitable that we do age, regardless of what the experts are saying. That we can, yes, we can probably live longer, certainly. And is there a boundary onto how long we can live? Well, only time will tell, but certainly, yes, we can extend life. My point that I made in the podcast was yes, an extension of life is great when you're living a real meaningful and purposeful life. However, the challenge we have in society today is that we generally uh, we, we're lost and we don't have a strong sense of meaning and purpose, generally speaking, and that's better in the pursuit of doing something that's meaningful for you is far better than obsessing over longevity when you're not happy with your current life or not satisfied with your current life. It's far better to get direction and to live with purpose than to obsess over living longer and more miserable. So I just I made that point really clear in that last episode. And please go back to it and listen to the episode so that you can have more context around what I'm about to share. However, I got some feedback as to, okay, Anthony, you mentioned this timeless mind, ageless body, and this state of presence where, in essence, we're not aging. And the question was, what is the mechanism behind that? How does that actually work? Well, this is what I'm going to attempt to answer in this podcast is that like there's not like in essence that happens, but we are only in that state for a fleeting moment. Like it's impossible to stay in that state of pure presence forever. And it's a bit like scientists trying to freeze something to the point that it's no longer moving. They haven't been able to achieve that. Like this absolute zero, there is still an element of movement. Yet it's so small, like, but it's minuscule. There is movement, right? And it's a bit like what I'm sharing around being present is that we will get a degree of presence, but we will be totally pure present. And that, I mean, I don't believe that we can because we there's so many distractions and our mind wanders and we may have an instance where we think we're totally present and we've got a transcendent state, but how transcendent it is and how present we are, there'll be a certain degrees at which we achieve that based on our practice and how good we are at being mindful. But it's inevitable that our mind will wander. It's inevitable that our thoughts will come in because the actual thing of life is transformational. So it never stands still. We can't stop it, right? But we can achieve degrees at which we can, I guess, slow it down or get it closer to that point of stopping. But that absolute, no, because life's a transformative process, or energy is transformative. It doesn't stand still. It doesn't stop. And we can preserve life or prolong it, but we'll never get to a point where we stop it. We stop the aging process. So that it's inevitable that we're aged. The speed and pace at which we age depends upon so many factors, and there's no, there's environmental factors, there's genetic factors, there's the fact of how well we can stay on purpose and live a meaningful life, and minimize our emotions. Obviously, our emotions age us. We either dream and fantasize over the future and get excited about it, or we're living in the past because the past was great, and therefore we're not present, and or our emotions are stuck in the past around, my body worked so much better back then, but now it's slower, and so we're comparing it to the past, but we're different. And we're taking our mind and getting emotional and sort of wishing things were better and getting more emotional and invoking an accelerated aging process in that thought. So we are best to find direction, and that's the number one thing, as opposed to taking pills and supplements, to thinking that yes, if I take this pill and supplement, I'll live longer. But isn't it better to find your purpose and live a meaningful life now, as opposed to I'll just extend my life and hoping I'll find that, or hoping I'll extend my life and find that? I much prefer people to find meaning and purpose now, in the now, and start living a more purposeful life, because that in itself will prolong your life and will prolong your activity and energy. It will bring you energy. So just popping pills doesn't necessarily going to invoke more vitality when you're losing vitality through your emotions because you're not happy now. And you're fixated on the future in terms of a better self. Well, why not find that now and not fixated and get emotional that you're not there yet, or get emotional that it was so much better in the past? So my long-winded answer to this question about this timeless mind, ageless body, it's not absolute. It is something that we can get closer towards, but we'll never achieve the absolute, because life is transformative. Energy is transformative. It's always changing. It changes form constantly, and it's moving, right? And so, yes, we can slow down the aging process, prolong life. That is possible. But as to how long, how much longer, no, nobody can tell you that, because there's so many variables that affect that. Things, yes, may work, certain supplements may work for an individual, but may have the opposite effect on someone else, because we're exposed. We all have a different genetic makeup, and we're exposed to different environmental factors, and we see the world differently because we're unique. So what works for one person, one influencer around longevity, may not work for you at all. But the one thing I do know that will work for you is that if you find purpose in your life, that's you, right? And just living out that purpose is a meaningful life, which will result in you living a much greater health span, which is ultimately what we want. We want that vitality to be able to enjoy the later years, as opposed to just prolonging life and prolonging a miserable life, or prolonging a life in a hospital. Nobody wants that. Everyone wants to be able to live a meaningful life and for longer, but best to discover that meaningful life now. So I really appreciate that question from the follower. And please, if you've got feedback around what I'm sharing and don't understand and looking for a mechanism of action, I'm happy to answer that in future podcasts and share those insights. It is very much a big black hole, so to speak. So I said to the person that provided the feedback was that you'll ask this question, I'll attempt to answer it, and then that will open more questions. But that's the process, right? It's this process of constantly being curious and looking for answers and learning more in that process. And that's what I like about doing the podcast, is that I'm constantly learning in doing it. I get challenged by followers asking me questions, and I'm thinking, oh, that's a really interesting question. I don't know if I have an answer. And I've had to think about this for quite some time in order to come back with a response. So the answer, the question was fantastic, and appreciate it, and really appreciate other listeners to ask more questions, not only to stimulate your learning, but it also stimulates my learning. And we can both learn and dance together, and both continue on this health trajectory where we're living more purposeful and meaningful lives, at the same time enjoying it, and embracing the fullness of life, as opposed to stuck in this polarization, is that I don't want to age, I'm anti-aging, I'm all about longevity. Well, it's inevitable that we are transforming, and if you call that aging, it might, you can also view that as becoming wiser, and embracing the wisdom that you gain along this journey of life. So, as I said, getting back, much prefer you to focus on purpose and meaning in your life and living out that, as opposed to obsessing over this longevity and anti-aging. I think you're best to break down the fantasy of anti-aging, because it's a fantasy, and not achievable. And yes, we can slow it down, but at the end of the day, we only want to slow it down if we've got a lot of contentment and satisfaction, and we're actually contributing a lot to others and to society. That's a lot of meaning there. So keep sending the questions. I'll keep answering them, and continue to listen to Health Up.